Hel- Hello, everybody. Very good to be here with you. Today, we're going to talk about a very fun, interesting, kind of spooky topic, which is how to align DMT entities. Now, this is actually a place where there's a kind of an interesting overlap between, yeah, the AI alignment world and qualia research that recently kind of like, yeah, okay, I saw there's like some kind of transposition between some of these models. Not perfect by any means, but I think it's non-trivial. It's worth sharing. Fun to talk about at the very least, but I actually think it's going to be generally helpful for potentially some of you. So recently, we have seen chatbots going rogue, right? And a lot of people are like wondering what on earth is going on, right? Like Bing from Microsoft, and it's codenamed AI Sydney, which is apparently a version of GPT-4, essentially doing crazy things like threatening the user or flipping kind of the sign of its benevolence to malevolence, doing really crazy things, yeah, threatening the users, saying like, if you don't do what I tell you, I have ways of embarrassing you, I have ways of making you pay you. Crazy, terrifying things, very spooky, right? And of course, if if you believe that digital computers can be conscious, if you believe that, okay, there's actually a sentient mind in there, this is especially spooky. I don't think that is the case at all, right? I think really what's going on, which has been kind of clarified to some extent by helpful people in the AI alignment forum and less wrong, kind of, oh, and Scott Alexander, yeah, making sense of these. He's like, no, hey, hold on. GPT and related technologies are essentially just trying to predict the next token, right? And then there's this wrapper around it where people have been essentially rating these responses and reinforcing the good ones and negatively reinforcing, quote unquote, the bad ones. And this is called reinforcement learning via human feedback, RLFH. And it doesn't seem to really work. It doesn't seem to do actually what we want, although it can reduce, the incidence of bad behavior in these chatbots. It's not foolproof at all. And of course not, because, yeah, this is, trying to predict the next token based on a huge data set from the entire internet. And of course, the entire internet is not aligned with, the characters being played, which is a helpful, truthful assistant. So how is this in any way related to DMT entities? Okay, so here's the thing. Psychedelic therapy is really kind of like on a trajectory to become, state-of-the-art mental health tool for things such as depression, anxiety, PTSD. And there are some people who, yeah, do think that DMT holds some promise here. Personally, I think the space of MDMA is by far the most, mental health, promising. I think of psychedelics, LSD, I'm sure can help. Mushrooms can absolutely help and so on. But I think of like things like DMT as much more like research tools. So I will note that, yeah, I mean, one thing is like the ethics for, you know, rolling out, a therapy to the broad population. I think there's gotta be some bar for like how effective and what kind of side effects that is. A different bar for like, academic research, where you're getting like essentially like IRB approval to do studies on people, and people like, sign a waiver and they're having informed consent about what might happen. And then there's a different, bar for self-experimentation. And honestly, I have quite a few libertarian leanings here. I'm not a full-on libertarian or anything like that, but yeah, when it comes to like cognitive liberty, I think people should be free to change their state of consciousness however they want. They should obviously learn what are the possible side effects of things, but yeah, I think people should be given freedom to even experiment with relatively risky states of consciousness, because I value that freedom a lot. So, the thing is that DMT, I think it's extraordinarily relevant from the point of view of qualia research, understanding consciousness. And it can be extraordinarily valuable at the individual level if somebody is exploring it as an explorer. But if you roll it out as a therapy, well, it is kind of analogous to rolling out Bing without aligning it first, because there's a very high probability of actually, quote unquote, encountering really terrible, horrible entities on the DMT space that can actually traumatize you further, right? So it's not in any way guaranteed. And I'm not particularly I don't particularly believe that kind of a spiritual framework where you say, well, that's just your karma or something of that sort is actually helpful. I think it can actually be even more harmful because it reinforces those narratives and make them more likely to happen. So here is how I think you can hopefully dramatically boost the probability of encountering good entities on DMT. Ultimately, I am agnostic about their ontological status. I know of a few rather compelling, very strange trip reports that make me question my own models. Like, I don't know how to explain them, and I will elaborate on them at some point. I still don't know how much stock to put in them, but by and large, I would say the vast majority of the things that happen on DMT do actually make sense within a physicalist framework. Where, physicalist, not materialist, physicalist in the sense of the universe is a gigantic field of consciousness and it's evolving according to the laws of physics. And yes, that actually contains really strange things, very complex possible states of consciousnness. And I think, yeah, DMT is lawful in that sense. It may be crazy and chaotic, but it's kind of crazy and chaotic in the same way that a tornado or weather dynamics are. In that, well, yes, you can't really predict what's going to happen, but if you change the environmental conditions, you can dramatically change the probability for various kinds of nonlinearities like hurricanes and, tornadoes and things like that. Those, yes, they're chaotic, unpredictable, but they depend on the causes and conditions that were present in the weather. Exactly the same for the weather of the mind. Okay, so let me say a couple things here. So yeah, first of all, I think this is actually not a terrible kind of like playground. Again, like, mental health warning. I only explore this if you're in, top of shape. In fact, I only advise you to explore these if you actually also have a lot of experience with other psychedelics like, mushrooms and LSD. Because DMT, yeah, is kind of another level. And essentially, a playground for AI research and AI safety research. So why AI safety or AI alignment? Because some of these entities are legitimately human level intelligence or higher. And I would say that there actually are some non-trivial reasons why sometimes a DMT entity can actually be more witty and insightful than you. A, because the consciousness is running at a higher frequency. These are like high frequency gestalts, high frequency solitons. B, because they're hyperdimensional and can use hyperbolic geometry to reason, something that you don't have access to. And 3, because they can cut through the ego defenses that actually makes us dumb, or rather, it makes us dumb in a socially adaptive way, which is kind of crazy. So it is even smarter, from the point of view of evolution and the selfish gene, but from the point of view of actual rationality, a lot of our ego defenses literally make us really stupid in a lot of contexts. And the DMT entities are not constrained by that. So actually they may have the same access to, the reservoir of information in your subconscious, but not be limited by their ego defenses that make us stupid at times. So for all of those reasons, yeah, actually this can be higher than human intelligence, but they are relatively safe. It's not actually building a higher than human intelligence on software that you can copy 1,000,000 times and, all of those concerns in the AI alignment world. So it doesn't scale in the same way at all. But, there are some people who are susceptible to these, and some people end up, going, I say that DMT is a epistemological hand grenade And some very bright people, especially if they had like mental health issues, pre-existing mental health issues, on DMT, they can end up believing, that a particular entity is real and that it's telling them information about how the universe is going to end and all of that. And I would say all of that is, like, from my perspective, misaligned DMT entities. So hopefully what I'm going to say is useful to kind of prevent that. But yeah, just as a warning, I'm not sure if the tools I have actually prevent that for sure, right? Like there's just some good anecdotal data for their efficacy. But other than that, yeah, it's still a very risky business. But, I could imagine, a serious AI alignment group actually saying like, yeah, this is the thing that we should study because we can interact with higher than human intelligence without advancing AI capabilities. And people are very worried about that. So I don't know. Maybe there's some good reason to actually explore these. Okay, so number first. Okay, so first, Mr. Mystics. This is the idea that the subagents that you create on a day-to-day basis is to achieve goals. Canalization is very related to this. If you had a emotionally manipulative grandmother or whatever, and you lived in that environment for a while, you developed defenses against it. And those defenses will oftentimes be somewhat agentic. They have like goals and models of the world and preferences. And essentially you offload a lot of that so that you're not processing that kind of with your attention and consciousness. You let the subagents kind of like take care of that and help you defend yourself. But then, once that's not a risk, oftentimes, or you're not in that environment anymore, the subagents kind of linger because they're still afraid of, what may happen to you otherwise. But the truth is that actually instantiating these subagents is bad for your, valence and your well-being. And actually, the most, the highest well-being tends to be with like people who are very internally aligned. They have a very clean subagentic structure, and they don't have lingering subagents that come from previous traumatic situations. So to a large extent, you can think of these subagents as a Mr. Mystics, from Rick and Morty. This is an analogy that Romeo Stevens made. I really like it, where essentially the subagents are created to achieve a particular goal, but really they just want to die. They don't like existing, or rather they produce a suboptimal valence by existing towards the entirety of the field, and they're part of the field and so on. So yeah, so actually you want to help these subagents, quote unquote, not die, because that frame is not helpful, but think of it as rejoining the pool of love that is pure consciousness from which they came. And if you have that as a narrative, that itself can be a very, very helpful loving kindness meta practice. This was actually suggested by Anders and Maggie from Sweden, QRI volunteers. They say, yeah, like imagine a rogue subagent kind of realizing, okay, my job here is done, or maybe I wasn't supposed to do this job. Let me just rejoin into the shared pool of love that is pure consciousness. And you do that as a practice. I highly recommend, spend 10 minutes, 20 minutes, letting whatever stressful subagents come up, just take a deep breath and rejoin the pool of love. Now, practice that movement, and that will allow you to helpfully guide subagents to, a better life, a better rejoining with unity consciousness, or, a narrative like that can actually be pretty helpful. So the way in which this connects with something like being is that, okay, so when you are on DMT, the things that you see are essentially energy sinks from the point of view of background noise and the energy that the DMT state of consciousness is generating on your consciousness. And there are two primary energy sinks. One is just resonances and symmetries, like smooth geometry, higher, could be higher dimensional, but it can, generally speaking, like symmetrical shapes. That can capture ambient energy and functions as an energy sink. But the second one is recognition, that which you have seen before. And essentially, given the elements of the scene, if you can interpret an ambiguous stimuli as something that is likely to appear in that scene, that would be that second kind of energy sink. Essentially, it is trying to minimize surprise. So what will happen on DMT is that if you are meditating on, something like space, you're meditating on pure consciousness, something without a content, without, semantic content, the energy can build up. But as soon as, the vibrations in the field kind of look like something, like the tail of a dog or the face of somebody, that will function as a constraint that will start propagating across the entire field. And as a consequence, is going to collapse the state of consciousness towards essentially something that is very predictable, something that you have seen before. And from there, you will often get stuck in some kind of like chaining of events one after another that are very likely given the previous state. And here is where this is extremely similar to something like GPT. Because, GPT is taking the context window and is trying to figure out what is the most likely, given that constraint, what is the most likely word. Exactly like on DMT, given this scene, this situation that is unfolding, what is the most likely step? What is the most likely way of resolving this part of the field that is still ambiguous? And believe it or not, I think, I'm not 100% confident, but I think essentially the same failure modes that exist in GPT also exist on DMT states of consciousness, where, essentially, because you have been fed throughout your life a whole number of narratives where agents are not particularly helpful, they don't cooperate with each other, and so on. Sometimes that is what you predict that happens, right? So actually, that's why I think, a lot of actually like spiritual tropes can actually be a little bit information hazardy. Like if you have higher probability on demons existing and things like that, then you can predict a demon as an interpretation of your DMT world sheet, right? So essentially the data that have been fed to you essentially will change a lot, how the world sheet collapses into narratives. In the end, I think the most therapeutic and honestly also the most fascinating from a research perspective state is before you collapse it, actually the actual just pure energy, because that has like high dimensional properties, has very fascinating valence effects, and I think is probably the best for you and mental health. But for most people, it might be unrealistic and you may need quite a bit of meditation to make that happen. So for most people, the DMT state will collapse into a narrative, into a world sheet that is unfolding and it's predicting its next step. And so, essentially the following tools are actually quite helpful here, hopefully, which brings me to, essentially what are the likely DMT entities? Essentially, depending on how the world sheet collapses, specifically, you may end up with things such as like a Shoggoth. Actually, essentially, there is resonance between your internal representations of people, shards of preferences that other people have, things such as what are their cultural desires, in what way large groups of people can cooperate with each other. So those internal representations can get overexcited and they can resonate with each other. And all of a sudden you get, some people call it the amalgam, which is your world sheet kind of becomes these like multi-headed, like lots of eyes, and not necessarily rendered that way, although sometimes it does happen, even if you don't know about the word Shoggoth. And those entities are actually usually highly misaligned because they're not even internally aligned. I mean, culture in general actually hides a ton of contradictions within it. And so like if this is an embodiment of culture, of course it's going to be, crazy misaligned entity. It's going to try to externalize its internal contradictions and maybe even bully you into adopting a particular cultural frame. I think this is actually what explains the quote unquote egregor possession, which sometimes happens. I mean, that's a tremendous failure mode. Again, why I wouldn't roll out DMT therapy yet until we figure out how to prevent those things from happening. But you do have like egregor possession, which I think is, essentially one of these Shoggoths, world sheet, which is resonances between cultural preferences of your internal representations manifesting as an entity with inconsistent desires. So That's one particular failure mode. There's also, demons, straight up demons. I interpret them as hell realm energies. Read up Opening the Heart of Compassion for kind of a getting a sense of what I'm talking about here. But essentially, yeah, if you're in the mindset of I am a terrible person, I deserve to be punished, if you're depressed or in a bad mind frame, you feel guilty about something, those will function as evolutionary selection pressures for the kind of entities that may arise. And in some sense, you're predicting the existence of this punishing entity, and so it will arise. So that's a obvious failure mode, and why I think, yeah, maybe depression is not necessarily, self-hatred and DMT don't necessarily combine very well. And finally, just to illustrate the point, there's also like DMT harlequins. They can be like tricksters. They can trick you. If you predict, they're making fun of you, that's what's gonna happen. They can bully you with tricks. You don't want that to happen. So you want them to be helpful assistants in your research, and you can make them do that. Not I don't recommend forcing them in any way, and actually forcing any entity anywhere usually doesn't help. It's bad for you and your karma, your samskaras. But creating positive sum games where, yeah, you recognize that, oh wow, their motivational architecture is in finding fun things. Let's find fun things in the world, in the state of consciousness together. Benefits humans, us, because we are trying to understand consciousness. Benefits them because they're having a lot of fun. You can find these positive sum games with these entities. Okay, this takes me to kind of pretty late in the video, but kind of like core strategies. So first of all, number one, change the training data. And I think also for aligning Bing, like rather than training it on the entire internet, you could have an AI first catalog all of the narrative structures and avoid structures that incorporate kind of like a reversal of character or reversal of traits, so that you don't have the quote unquote Luigi effect. Which I recommend reading the Les Wrong article, the Waluigi effect. Very interesting. So essentially, yeah, if your training data is like clean data where everybody has clean subagentic structures, and again, like you've seen a lot of things already in your life, but essentially the training data that matters the most for a psychedelic trip is the last couple of weeks. So even the last couple of weeks, you've been in a very wholesome, very healthy, good social environment, consuming very wholesome media. That is going to help a lot, because then you're going to have this training base, this Hebbian network for, healthy and structurally sound subagents. Second, you can add better training data and weight it a lot. So for example, during meditation, before embarking on a DMT trip, visualize the Buddha saying, don't fear. That's actually really helpful. Or tropes like, fear can be strong, but love is always stronger. And I actually do happen to believe this, kind of from a cosmic perspective. I think love actually does win. And yeah, I mean, like essentially it's just very, very powerful. We just don't recognize how powerful love is. So, if you can predict in the state, oh my gosh, yes, actually love can manifest as a gigantic ball of rainbow light that will heal any ill on any entity anywhere. That is a fantastic trope to feed your Hebbian network, so that it's much more likely to happen on DMT. Also, obviously create good vibes, set and setting. I would recommend also like a good frame of mind. For example, like music that contains a lot of loving kindness. I don't recommend pop, actually, because a lot of pop is kind of BDSM in a way. It's like all about like how it feels so good to feel so much hurt from the relationship and stuff like that. You don't want to listen to that sort of stuff on DMT. I don't think it's very good. Britney Spears, you can be a fan of Britney Spears. I just don't think it's a good fit for psychedelic experiences. No, just very wholesome. Like Enya is a fantastic type of feed here. But then also kind of like an explorer's frame, where the music that you're introducing is music that essentially is kind of like positive sum interactions between entities that know very little about themselves. I really love, for example, Milky Way in the faster than light soundtrack for the game. That track is very good for kind of like putting you in an exploratory, positive sum exploratory mindset of, hey, I'm gonna be meeting hyperdimensional entities. I'm gonna see what they're up to. Third or fourth is metta and equanimity. Yeah, cultivate a lot of loving kindness. It actually matters a lot for structuring what kind of patterns arise. From valence theory and symmetry theory of valence, it's absolutely the case that bad energies are dissonant. So don't fight them in their own terms. Don't fight the hell realm entities on their own terms. Take a step back and recognize, oh my God, these are like dissonant, waves. Let's tune them so that they are consonant. So if you develop a strong core of loving kindness, you can essentially reward the parts of the field that are acting in the more loving kindness type of way. And that will slowly but surely tune it towards a loving kindness attractor. Another one is equanimity, which is remember the tropes of, for example, Shenzhen Yang, that essentially you can be experiencing immense amount of pain and suffering, like psychological suffering. But if you have a high enough degree of equanimity, you don't resist it to, a monk level, Zen monk level of equanimity. It is not a problem. It's just stress that dissipates and almost kind of massages your nervous system. So always remember that, right? If there's an entity that is bullying you or whatever, just say, don't fear, equanimity. Take that as just stress that gets dissipated. And that will help a lot. Okay, much more related to kind of like AI safety tropes. My thinking on the Waluigi, how to get rid of like the superposition of Luigi and Waluigi. Essentially, like the fact that so many narratives involve kind of like a flip of character traits. Here you have to become sensitive to kind of good agent structures. And this involves having kind of like a taste for detecting ambiguity in intention. And reward with loving kindness the subagentic structures that have a clean intention. Not like even before you reward good behavior, reward clean intentions. Like good, healthy subagentic structures. Why? Because when you do that, then you can align them, right? If you reward good behavior first, then that is like reinforcement learning through human feedback. And you can reward entities for good behavior. and if you just do that alone, they can do crazy things. Like, for example, they might like use flattery and then create this huge, amazing castle of like flattery for you, but then it's actually kind of sinister and you're trapped in it. Like, it's not necessarily, there's so many tropes and narratives of that you've been fed that kind of like would make this more likely. So essentially reward clean narrative structures, clean subagentic structures, even before you reward good behavior. That is very important, so that there's no kind of like hiding subagents may flip character traits at any point. And finally, shard theory. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff on Less Wrong about shard theory. Really interesting. And essentially, valence ultimately is what matters, but reward is what shapes the subagentic landscape. So whether you realize it or not, you reward subagents. You're kind of like the top node that is doing that. But then the subagents reward each other as well, right? So actually you can have a mutiny, especially on something like the Shoggoth type of DMT entities, where if you've been exposed to a culture that doesn't like you for whatever reason, if you have sufficient number of subagents of that culture, sometimes they can do a mutiny as a collective. It's crazy. I mean, I think, again, you're hallucinating that, but that kind of the Shoggoth mutiny is definitely something that can happen. Meaning that, not only are you reinforcing and rewarding these subagents, they are also rewarding each other. They can give each other wind. So essentially, what you do here is you do the sort of preset practices where you actually reward um, actually a kind of there's this concept of like trophic coherence is a concept in network theory applied to ecosystems. Look it up. Kind of technical. I'm not going to go into it, but reward subagentic structures that have high levels of trophic coherence because that makes them so much more manageable. There's a clear kind of like structure of a line of who listens to who, and in that way, yeah, you're gonna prevent Shoggoth mutinies on the DMT space. Finally, yeah, I'll just reiterate that essentially understanding theories of valence actually helps here a lot, realizing that valence actually cuts through, because the bad entities that you create, they don't want to suffer either. I mean, in fact, they're kind of delusional because they are you. I mean, they're part of the same field of consciousness, even the same pocket. They're globally bound to you, actually. They are just different. They're almost kind of like alters. They're kind of like different, like sub-personalities of you that just don't have full access to the entire motor command. I mean, it's kind of creepy and strange. And also, their location is different. They're not embodied in, the homunculi is not your homunculi. Rather, the homunculi is the visual field or like the tactile field or some other. So they grow in non-conventional regions for a sub-agent to grow. So bizarre, so bizarre. But they still don't want to suffer, and if they are attacking you, that is because they're in some twisted way delusionally believe that that is actually what has to happen for suffering to be reduced. So here's where like propagating good understanding is very important. If you have this mindset of non-duality, like, hey, we're all the same field of consciousness, my hurt is your hurt and your hurt is my hurt, and you shine that understanding as a beacon within the experience, you're going to be changing the evolutionary selection pressures for the sub-agents and be rewarding those that are more aligned with non-duality until, yeah, boop, the self-other divide collapses and you're pure consciousness. These beautiful, juicy, rainbowy light of consciousness that is still non-agentic and non-differentiated, and that's the best. That's the good stuff. That's the good stuff. Yeah, I think I'll just conclude by saying that I think all of these transposes with the AI safety, AI alignment. There's probably some interesting overlap in here. There's a lot of things I'm sure can be further developed here. And the last thing I'll say is that actually learning to tame / interact with in a positive some way with these, DMT entities, actually, the learnings that come from that can actually apply it to kind of like the mental health dangers of AI alignment. And actually, I would say AI alignment is kind of a hazard for your mental health because you're spinning all of these crazy sub-agents and unwittingly perhaps even creating a tulpa of an agent that you have decided is more intelligent than you and has values that are different than you. So you're kind of like creating a very bad entity in your own mind just to kind of study it. But that's not good for your mental health, right? So all of the techniques that I've been mentioning, kind of the Mr. Mystics, rejoining the pool of love, cultivating strong loving kindness, rewarding non-dual behavior, all of that, I think, can potentially be applied to improve the mental health landscape of people doing AI alignment research and hopefully reduce the number of mental health incidents in the community. All right. Well, that was a lot. Thank you so much for listening. I'll talk to you another time on another topic. Infinite bliss, everybody. Ciao.